Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LPL Spring Playoffs Round Number 2 overview and analysis video. We are in the second round, of course, of the LPL Playoffs. We have gotten down to technically our top 8 teams, and we are going to determine who will make the top 6, of course. That means that every team from this point onwards is at maximum 2 series away from getting to that top 4, that double elimination stage of the bracket. That really has to be the goal for all of these teams. I know that everybody's trying to win the LPL. I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that that shouldn't be your goal if you're in the playoffs. However, I think getting to that top 4 is really where I think all of the teams that aren't already in the top, 3 are kind of feeling. So really excited to see what happens in today's series. We've got a couple of very fun matchups. Let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section below. Did they go as you expected, or were they kind of surprises to you? Would love to know if you were shocked really in any way by the outcomes down in the comments section below. There were definitely some fun games, and I'm excited to talk about it. If you want to know my thoughts on what I expected going into this, and also what I thought of these, or half of these teams, I guess, in round number 1, you can check out that round 1 video linked up in the iCard right now. Of course, in that, not only will be, all of the analysis for the round 1 series, which half the teams today ended up playing in to qualify for this stage in the first place, but also full previews and analyses of the series that happened today, the round 2 series, kind of giving you my thoughts on where I think each series would end up going in terms of who I thought would win, why I thought they would win, and where I think each team might be able to generate their own advantages. But that's all linked in that video. We're going to save that today. We're going to quickly kind of, talk about some of those previews, but really we're here to jump into the action. So let's go ahead and do it. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in both of the series that happened in round number 2, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be previewing our round 3 matchups very quickly at the end of the video, giving thoughts and opinions on what might happen there. Those series obviously matter a lot, because once we get past this round into round number 3, then the winner of that series ends up qualifying for top 4. So obviously, you want to stay alive here. It is win or go home for all 4 teams involved today, but they are still all on the hook for later in the week if they do win. So without further ado, let's jump right into our first series, the top of the bracket. As you know, the LPL bracket, at least before top 4, is split into halves, and so the top side of the bracket here starts off with the number 5 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on the number 9 seeded Team WE. And this series is interesting for a couple of different reasons. I think both of these teams have been, at times, favored on this channel throughout the year, at least in terms of public perception. I've been a bit higher on both of them for different reasons at different points. I think they are both significantly more consistent than people give them credit for. And again, I think, relatively speaking, they are both high floor, low ceiling types of teams, although Ninjas in Pyjamas definitely have a high ceiling if things start to change in terms of their play style and how some of these players end up adapting to playing with each other. However, in their current forms, I do think they're both relatively high floor teams that don't make a ridiculous amount of mistakes, but on the flip side, both of them have pretty major question marks in terms of some players that just have not been consistent at all. Of course, WE winning the previous series, coming in here as the lower seed, they were able to take on OMG and beat them in round number 1. That's a pretty solid win. They were the lower seed, so it's nice to see them come out of that series with a win, but that was predicted, so it's not entirely shocking to see it happen. I think a couple of players really stood out as positives in that series, most notably Awandi, who was my player of the series. I've been really low on Awandi, not just this year, but basically the entirety of his career. I've just never really seen him as this elite level support or upper level support that everybody, kind of talks about him like. He was on these LNG teams that were doing really well in previous seasons. He's been to Worlds. He knows what it's like to win, at least at this level, even if it's not like the entire league. I've just never really seen him as an integral part of these teams. He's very aggressive, and he's a roamer. He's really not somebody who ever wants to play the 2v2. So it was nice to see that basically for the first time this season, WE actually invested in that. They really kind of took that to heart and said, okay, well, if you want to roam and move around, then we're going to draft Pryo in the mid lane, and we're going to draft a jungler that can make plays with you and keep you stable like a Maokai or a Sejuani. And all of a sudden, those Awandi roams were becoming incredibly effective, and you put Stay back in the lineup in the bot lane, who's a significantly better weak side bot laner, as opposed to Prince, who really does not play well in the confines of whatever WE's system is here. All of a sudden, this team starts to play a little bit more interestingly, very different from the style that they had had in the regular season this year, because that was mostly, kind of formulated around top lane. That was formulated around Wayward, who was kind of their big carry over the course of this year, investing a lot of resources into topside, really the only team in the league to do that on any sort of consistent basis. And for the most part, it did pay off for them. It gave them kind of a floor because bad top laners just weren't going to be able to survive against Wayward, who is a relatively good player, and good teams would beat them anyways. And so it didn't really matter. But again, I think expanding your styles and kind of moving to this more macro-oriented, this more map control-oriented style, I think was very positive for WE, and it does give me some confidence that they can be relevant in a series like this. But for Ninjas in Pyjamas, they are just the more talented team, and so you would imagine that they should be favorites going into this, but there have been some concerns. Yes, Rookie and Photic, I think, have been really good throughout this year. I think the two carry roles for Ninjas in Pyjamas have been very positive and very much have pushed this team forward. However, the rest of this roster is certainly not as well-rounded as maybe you would have once hoped. The top side from OMG coming over really has not been great. Aki, I think, has been fine. Certainly not somebody that I've complained about all that much over the course of this year, but he's not been that top 4-ish jungler that he was in 2023 for that OMG team. And Shanji, who was really breaking out as one of the best top laners in the LPL, a player that I was really looking at this year as somebody who could potentially take that next step into becoming like a Bin caliber player or a 369 caliber player for this team. He has regressed back to his rookie version of himself, where he's just been incredibly inconsistent. He is obviously incredibly talented. We know what he can do at his best, but it's just not really come out in 2024. And like we said, WE does kind of notoriously put a lot of pressure and attention into the top lane. That could potentially be a way for WE to stay in this series, but outside of that, I don't really see a lot of lanes that WE actually has an advantage in. Photic and Juwo have been better this year than Stay and Awandi. I think Photic is the best player in the bot lane, at least in terms of the current performance. Rookie is certainly better than Fofo, even if I am a bit higher on Fofo in terms of in-game than a lot of other analysts, and Aki is certainly better than Hang in terms of consistency. And so you would imagine Ninjas in Pyjamas would be favorited here, but again, there is an outline for WE to be able to come in and win this series. We'll see if they can follow it. Of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Team WE. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a shot fired. Really nice to see them take control and, gain that momentum, really capitalize off of what they were doing very well in that previous series against OMG when they won 3 games in a row, 2, 3, and 4. They come out in game 1 and they look excellent. Honestly, very slow game, very controlled, quite frankly, very boring. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. This was a very boring game number 1 in comparison to a lot of the other action that we're getting in the LPL. However, whatever works, works. If this is the way you have to win games, if you're WE, then go for it. Trundle was kind of the more interesting pick of the draft here. I think a lot of people are going to look at the Yone in the mid lane, but we've seen Yone kind of be used as a scattered counter pick in a lot of different scenarios. But Trundle being pulled out here, I think, actually does change the composition of how NIP wants to play this game. They're very tanky, and they're going to be very difficult to kill without the Trundle, and so I think adding something like that on R5 was actually a very good pick in favor of WE. Adding alongside that a dominant late-game carry duo of Azir and Zeri. All of a sudden, NIP is on a timer. I get that they have the Jinx, who's also going to scale into that late game. You've got a Sejuani to be able to set things up. Tom, Yone, like all of these champions are relevant. I just don't really see a world in which you're able to actually match the damage of WE if you do get to these late-game fights, and that's essentially exactly what happened. Every single Baron, especially the ones towards the back half of the game, it was really hard for NIP to actually step up and do anything in those fights because they just weren't able to front to back against WE, and so give a lot of credit to them. Player of the game's kind of difficult because this really was just kind of a slow, controlled game. I don't think anybody made any individually unbelievable plays, but I'm going to agree with Broadcast, and I'm going to give it to Fofo here in the mid lane. The Azir was definitely the most important part of this comp. I think they played around him relatively well. Whether you want to point to the Trundle or the Rakan or even the Zeri as potentially the standout member, I think all of those things are relatively viable depending on your view of this game, but from my perspective, Fofo's Azir, I think, was really the driving point. I talk all the time in other regions and in other videos on this channel about map pressure and about the middle of the map and how important it is in the current meta. In fact, I've said the same thing on this channel when it comes to the LPL in particular, and I think Fofo actually being the better mid laner in game number 1 was very, very influential. I'm not entirely shocked to see that happen here. Fofo has been a good player at this level for a while, even a great player, just not an elite player. You would imagine Rookie is an elite player because not only is it Rookie Rookie, but he's having a really good split. But Fofo can beat Rookie. Like, he has enough talent to be able to go one-on-one with him in lane, and so it was nice to see that kind of come to fruition in game one if you were a WE fan. Stay and Awandi were also really solid. A lot of really good creation in the back half by Awandi. What I really like about LPL supports is that they find these ridiculously cracked flanks. Like, I was talking about this with Crisp in the previous week in round number 1, or the previous round, I guess, of the playoffs here, where it's really fun watching LPL supports play Rakan because they just go for these ridiculous flank opportunities, and Awandi did something very similar in this game. Stay was excellent on the Zeri, really took everything that was given to him and perpetuated it. The Trundle was a good pick, and I thought Wayward was pretty solid on the Rex side, really not all that consequential until some of the late game fights, which you wouldn't really imagine for that champion. But overall, a good game for WE, and kind of a sad loss for NIP. I think you would have imagined they would have come out fighting a little bit more, but this was a very passive, very boring, very slow, and a not very aggressive game from them. And again, I understand why, but maybe trying to play around Rookie a bit more because he was getting gold throughout parts of this game could have really changed the tide. Now, the Yone was really more of an impact in terms of when he was able to get that ultimate off on multiple people in fights in the back half, but outside of that, like, who are we really blaming? I guess Aki's gonna get dud of the game. I don't really have, like, a clear choice for this. I don't think Aki played particularly horrible. He's playing Sejuani, and so when he goes in and the team is behind them, they're just kind of gonna lose, but playing Sej into Trundle and losing so much pressure in the early game, it just makes it so difficult to be able to try and fight back at around 20-25 minutes, and I think Aki did run into that problem, but again, I have to reiterate, this really was more of a team loss than it was an individual loss for Aki or for any of the players on this team. Shanji certainly could have been better in the early game on the Renekton. Like I said, they could have played around Rookie a bit more on the Yone, and I think things could have gotten better. Photic and Juo really never had any prio, but they also really never had any gold to do anything and create their own prio, so it was just kind of a difficult situation overall for NIP. I think they need to put their pedal to the metal. I think they need to play a lot faster than this. They are more mechanically talented, and typically speaking, when you are the better team, when you are more talented, it suits you more to go to these more aggressive games. Not only because you can just kind of flex your mechanics, but even if WE ends up getting small leads, hopefully you can chip away at those by winning fights if you are the better team. Typically speaking, that's how I would approach things. But for WE, this 1-0 lead is very big. If you can win the second game, now all of a sudden you're up 2-0, you've put NIP on series point, and that's a panic mode. Winning 3 games in a row is not easy, so a big game number 2 here. But who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece, and obviously this is massive. You never want to go down 0-2 in a series in the LPL. There are just too many good teams. It is so hard to win 3 games in a row against anybody in the LPL, especially when your back is against the wall, against a team that has shown that they can beat you twice in a row. It would not be a good idea to lose this game number 2, so credit to NIP. I think they went for a much more aggressive comp, basically exactly what I was asking for, a lot more agency, a lot more priority in terms of what they should have in the early game, even if their scaling isn't quite as dominant, although honestly, it's just as good. Like, Rumble plus Jinx is still going to be a problem in front-to-back 5v5 team fights. You just don't have that big tank on the front line to be able to kind of help you out in that regard, but WE don't have that either. They have double Enchanter Zeri, and so, you know, you're going to be sitting in a relatively good position if you are able to establish that pressure early, but you're going into a WE team that not only has that momentum from game number 1, but also has a Xin Zhao on a player in Hang who really does want to play aggro early, and so it wasn't a given that they were going to come out and win this, but thankfully they got some really important performances, none more so than their top laner who's getting player of the game here in game 2. It's going to be Shanji. Thank God this happened for Shanji. I mean, truly, we were getting concerned with the performances that he was putting out so far in the spring split because he had just not been very good for NIP. There really was no other way to put it. He was an average to below average top laner, not just below average for expectations in terms of the entire league, was actively losing games for Ninjas in Pyjamas, and that was really starting to get concerning, but he gets one of his signature picks here. In the Rumble, it's not quite AP Shyvana, but it's pretty darn close. It can do a lot of the similar things, and so Shanji ends up executing well. We'll get to Wayward in a second, but Wayward tried his best to contest. He certainly wasn't giving over the lane for free. He just kind of got beat in this game, and we'll talk about that, but, you know, really the avenue that WE had to get back in this series, or to, you know, we were talking about as their advantage, their particular advantage in terms of team composition against Ninjas in Pyjamas and what they had shown this year was top lane, was the potential for Wayward to get really far ahead and just kind of be able to carry that throughout the series. I don't think Wayward individually played horrible in this game, but Shanji was better and certainly was more impactful, and that is going to be a bit of a problem for WE moving forward, and so that's going to be something to continue to monitor. Juo was awesome on the Rakan. Again, I love watching LPL Rakan. He is so active. He is so fun to watch in team fights. These players just know how to play him at such a breakneck pace. I'm honestly shocked that players play anything else when given the opportunity in this region. I get why he was a B1 pick. I think he is the best engager in the game right now. now. Nautilus is still pretty strong, and he's getting banned out for a reason, but Rakan is right up there in terms of that for me. And Juo, I think, obviously piloted him very well. Rookie was very good this game on the Talia. Everywhere on the map, Aki was deathless on Nocturne, which is not an easy thing to do in Pro. I always talk about how Nocturne's goal in Pro is typically to try to trade 1-for-1, diving onto the backline, but he was very good at timing his ultimates correctly and playing along with the rest of his team. And Photic, it's not like he was running behind on the Jinx. This just was a very good game. Going from a pretty slow game, I would say, in game 1 to a little bit more of an aggressive game, and NIP was definitely more controlling it. It's exactly what we wanted to see from them. And then WE, again, just kind of got outpaced. You really built this comp around trying to get your Zeri as online as possible, as quickly as possible. Karma plus Janna, yeah, you are building to make sure that Zeri, that stay, can win you the game. And weirdly enough, I don't think I like this from the side of WE. For almost any other team in the league, I would love this draft and I would love this playstyle, because I think it's honestly undervalued right now to invest in your hyper carry, AD carry, instead of just leaving them on a weak side and hoping they scale no matter what. I think Karma plus Janna could actually be a bit of a problem, especially for players like Fofo and Awandi who are individually good at those champions, but this team just doesn't play around bot lane particularly well. It's really not something that they are good at, and so investing this draft into making sure that Zeri is in a good spot is really not something that I think plays into the strengths of what this team has shown, and I think the rest of the team suffered. Wayward's dead of the game in the top lane. Again, he tried to contest, but so much pressure was put on the top side by Ninjas in Pyjamas because Shanji was very good, and, Wayward just couldn't quite hold up. He's playing an early game champion. He needed a bit more assistance in this one, and he didn't quite get it. I think Hang is directly responsible for that. If you want to give dead of the game to Hang, I definitely think you can do that. I think as Xinjia, you just have to continue to skirmish as often as possible early on in games, especially before Nocturne hits 6, and I think you really can't establish a lot of prio in that time period, and I don't think Hang was fast enough. And again, I can't really criticize Fofo, Stay, and Awandi. They did the things that they were supposed to do. Perhaps Stay could have been a little bit more efficient with a lot of the resources he got, but I don't think he was individually all that bad. I think WE just went to a game plan that was against what they're good at, and they ended up paying the price for it, but the series is only tied up at 1 apiece. It now moves to essentially a regular season best of 3 here. The person who wins the next 2 of 3 is going to be moving on to the next round, so game 3 becomes infinitely more important. I've said it many times on this channel, when you go into a game 3 at 1-1, this game 3 becomes the most important game for the rest of the series, to make sure that you have the tempo and to make sure that you don't have to win both of the final 2 games, which is a much more difficult thing to do. So, who's going to be able to take the momentum? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team WE. They are going to take game 3. They're retaking control of this series, and they're going to be up 2-1 now, which is a really nice place to be. I think controlling the series in terms of winning games 1 and 3, the odd number games, that's a pretty nice place to be in general, just because it gives you the confidence that you're never really behind at any point in a series, and it basically forces Ninjas in Pyjamas to essentially play catch-up in every single game, even going into the final one if it were to get to that. So this is a really nice win for WE. I really like being able to, come out with a pretty interesting draft, drafting the Dr. Moon no jungle. It's not the weirdest thing in the entire world. I think it does fit in kind of the idea of what jungle is right now, especially in the LPL with how it's developed over the course of this very brief playoffs so far. It's really kind of leaned a lot more towards, let's go tanks, let's go something that can be really beefy, that can kind of hold an area, and then we can use that to then propel our mid laner or our bot laner or our support into a much more aggressive position for them to be kind of the big playmaker, and not necessarily in a scaling way, but just more so in like a control way, if you will. Like Maokai is very good at that because his ultimate is so good at being able to secure objectives. You have a hard time being able to approach and really do anything with him. I think Mundo can fill a similar void just without nearly the level of CC. So I don't hate this draft pick. I think it's a little bit of cooking, but I don't think it's crazy. And it clearly worked out for them because they were able to win and Mundo went deathless. So I guess he can't really complain too much. Player of the game for me in game 3 is going to go to Wayward, though. In the top lane, the tables have turned from game number 2. Certainly a bit of an opposite scenario here where Wayward was absolutely the better of these two. Him on Rek'Sai, I think, just kind of fits. It gives him a lot of agency in the early game, and it does let the team play a little bit more through him. I was very confused in the first couple of games when it felt like they were starting to abandon him. I get the idea that, they didn't really invest a lot into him in in the series number 1 against OMG, and they kind of got away with it because OMG just don't really have the kind of players that can take advantage of that. Cube is not really the kind of top laner that can take advantage of that, but Shanji's a little bit of a different beast, and this team's not going to be afraid, Ninjas in Pyjamas that is, of of actually investing into it if it feels like you are actively abandoning that lane. And so getting back on the train of getting Wayward into a better position, I think was definitely a positive. And man, he plays laning phases so well from a winning position. When he plays well, he plays really, really well. He was able to transition his lead in a very high level. There was a reason I put this guy in my all-pro teams, because I do believe that he was an all-pro in terms of his performance this year. I've always been a bit higher on Wayward, and I think that's coming to fruition here. Fofo continues to look very good in this series. I don't think Rookie was nearly as quote-unquote outclassed, but playing Corki Azir, you know, obviously a lot of people think this is a scaling matchup, and it is. It's obviously, I'm not trying to say that it's not, but Azir actually can do a lot of interesting things in the mid game because of how slow Corki ends up being, and especially because it's double marksman on the side of Ninjas in Pyjamas. You really don't actually have a lot of tools to be able to stop that Azir from just being this super long range poke mage and going for these aggressive engages when he feels like it. Same thing with Stay on the Zeri, Awandi on the Rakan. It's just a more active comp, and I think generally that is going to help you overall. I know I praise scaling a little bit on this channel, at least in certain roles, but what we've seen very regularly over this meta is if you draft too much scaling, if you draft Maokai Corki in the middle of your map, like Ninjas in Pyjamas did in this game, you're just not going to have enough firepower to ever get to the part of the game where you actually want to be relevant, unless you really think that like Lucian Nami is going to dominate or Renekton is really going to get ahead. Neither of those things ended up happening, so credit to WE, really credit to Wayward for going out and winning this. But for Ninjas in Pyjamas, again, I think a lot of this can be chalked up to just, you didn't have a particularly good draft. I think Aki and Rookie actually were the two that played the best here. I think if this game had gone a little bit longer than 31 minutes, perhaps this could have been a little bit more interesting, because I think you look at some of those like end of the game fights and they were a lot closer than they were at 15 and 20 minutes. For Ninjas in Pyjamas, Rookie in particular had really started getting online and started doing a lot of damage. In those fights, it just was a little too late. Photic and Juo really never got online. Stay and Awandi, I think, have been better throughout this series up until this point. It's not entirely shocking. You know, Photic and Juo aren't exactly the most consistent duo in the entire world, but it's not what I would have predicted. And then again, dead of the game is going to go to Shanji in the top lane. Like we talked about in game 2, it's really not entirely Shanji's fault that Wayward played really well, but I do think Shanji could have played better in this game. I think he gave over resources in situations that he didn't have to, and also his fighting was really lax in this game. He just wasn't very clean in terms of his Renekton mechanics. Typically speaking, this is a very good champion for him, so I wouldn't expect that to continue, but it was certainly something to monitor. But again, shout out to Aki and Rookie, who tried their best to pull some stuff back. I really like Maokai. I think he's the best jungler in the game in terms of what the LPL does, like the style that they end up playing. I don't think there is like a definitive best jungler in the game at the current moment, at least in terms of my perception of it, but Maokai has definitely kind of established himself as the one with the highest priority. We're going to see it a lot on B1, I think, not only in this series, not only in the next series, but throughout probably the rest of playoffs, I would imagine. And Corki is not a champion that I like. It's kind of funny. One of the reasons I really like Maokai is because he pairs up so well with like very aggressive, high priority mid laners. We saw it a lot with Tristana in previous series. Obviously, that's been getting banned throughout the beginning of this series, but Corki does not fill a similar role. I understand the double marksman idea, but Corki is not the same kind of champion as Tristana. I think you need to go for something more aggressive if you want to get away with Maokai in the jungle, but overall, I don't think it was a horrible game for NIP. You just lost to the best player on the Rift, and that was Wayward at the very least in game number 3, but WE does have a big advantage now. They only have to win one of the last 2. You got to go undefeated the rest of this series if you're Ninjas in Pyjamas to keep your tournament hopes alive. It would be pretty disappointing to see them go out here, but WE is one game away from being able to push themselves into the round number 3 against FPX, a very winnable series for whoever ends up winning this. And so for WE, you really want to get this series over within 4 games. You do not want to go to 5, but can Ninjas in Pyjamas push us to that silver scrapes? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up this series at 2 apiece. They're going to keep themselves alive. And we're going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. That is a very, very good sign. I will say this was a bit of a boring game as well. I'm going to be honest with you guys. This has been a bit of a boring series. Really not a lot has happened in terms of monumental, unbelievable plays. I think game 2 was probably the most entertaining, but that was really only because Shanji was actually just going off on Rumble, and there was a lot to like about that performance in general. This was just another kind of, okay, they're playing Sedge plus Jinx, and let's play around the Jinx. Let's get the Jinx fed, and eventually the game will be over. Like, you know, I'm not trying to sit here and say that it's horrible that I have to watch League of Legends, but this isn't exactly the most entertaining League of Legends that I've ever watched in my entire life. That being said, congratulations to Ninjas in Pyjamas for tying up this series and equalizing things here in 35 minutes. It was a well-executed game from them, and I think that's a pretty positive thing to say overall. Player of the game pretty obviously has to go to Photic. The entire game revolved around him. Ninjas in Pyjamas clearly had one goal this game, and that was to get that Jinx online. They've been trying to do this game after game after game. They finally were able to get it here in game number 4, and it paid off. I think Jinx is still one of those champions that can really dominate the late game. People talk about Smolder and Zeri as these really broken champions, but there's a reason that we're seeing, Jinx as one of the highest priority ones here in the LPL, at least in the playoffs so far, and that's because the reliability of Jinx is very high. Really, the skill of execution is significantly lower, in my opinion, than Smolder or Zeri, especially Zeri, and I think it just gives you a lot more options for how you want to play your mid game, because Jinx actually can function in that stage of the game, even if she isn't as inevitable as, those other two champions are, I would say, overall. But Fodic, I think, played really well. The concern going into this series was that Fodic might struggle a bit, not because I think there was anything on tape to indicate that Fodic was going to be bad in a series like this, but rather the history of Fodic in the playoffs has not been particularly kind. He has been a bit of a playoff underperformer in his time in the LPL on Victory 5, last year on Ninjas in Pyjamas. He really has not shown up in any sort of major way in any of these playoff series, so to see them play around him in a pivotal game 4 where if they lose, they are going home, and for him to actually pay that back out with a win, I think is very positive. Now, his job was relatively easy, but he was the main character of this game, so it's hard to give him anything other than player of the game. To that credit, though, Aki was sensational in this game. It is really, really easy to point to the Jinx as the carry and the one who did all the damage and the one that they could play around, and rightfully so. I think Fodic did a great job of positioning, but Aki got him that lead. Like, he was bot lane consistently, was always playing around that Jinx, really trying to set up a lot of opportunities for him to be able to get ahead, and Aki was really good in this game, and I think that's really a positive sign as well. Aki is somebody that people online have complained about. I know people have talked about potentially this team bringing in someone like Tarzan, and while I don't hate that idea in concept, I don't even know if that's really an upgrade to Aki in any sort of way. I think that's almost disrespectful to Aki, and I'm someone who likes Tarzan, but I also like Aki. I think he's a really good player, and I think you need to give him more time. He's gotten better as the year has gone along, and he's always going to be a little bit less of a focal point, a little bit less like popular in terms of the plays that he's making, if only because he's not really like a star carry kind of player. He's not playing Graves every game. He's playing Sejuani and Maokai and things that are going to help out the rest of the team. Obviously, he can play Xin Zhao, he can play things like that, Lee Sin, but it's the Sej and the Maokai that I think are really going to help this team move forward in the playoffs, and he was awesome on Sej in this game. Perfect tempo, really able to capitalize on some of the windows that were created by the Talia roams. I just really like how Aki played it, and I think he deserves a lot of the credit here. Zhuo was good as well. I think that was definitely a positive, and, Rookie and Shanji were fine, but, this was more of a team effort, I would say, overall. Fodic was definitely, like I said, the main character in terms of how they wanted to play, but credit specifically to Aki for getting him to that spot. And then for WE on the other side, just kind of a boring, slow, not great game. Credit to Wayward, he was really good in this game on Cassante. I get it that champion's kind of broken and really can kind of take over in almost any circumstance. It doesn't take exactly the most amount of skill in the world to dominate on Cassante, but Wayward was excellent here. I think that there were moments where Stay was fine. I don't think Hang was like completely useless or anything, but pretty clear choice for dud of the game for me, and that's going to go to Awandi on the Janna. 2 games of Janna for Awandi in this series and 2 losses. Certainly not ideal for the champion that he made his name on in solo queue, but I just don't know if Janna is really the move for how WE have wanted to play in recent weeks. And we were talking about how well they played in the previous series in a lot of circumstances where Awandi was given Rakan and Stay was given, Zeri or something on weak side, and just you got to play with the Maokai and you got to move around the map, and Fofo was given something he could just win lane on really without a lot of thought, like the Tristana or like the Nico or something of that nature, and you could just play really aggro through the middle of the map, having Awandi roam constantly and just playing this like 3v1 style mid, getting every objective and, just kind of scaling the game that way. It's really not been the way that they wanted to play it here. They've been focused a lot more on bot lane in particular, and I really don't think it's working. Again, I think they're getting away from their style, and it is kind of hurting them. I think Fofo could have been better in this game on the Azir. He has kind of trailed off in this series as it's gone longer and longer. I think every single game has gotten worse from him as they've continued onwards, but Awandi simply needs to be better, and I don't want to see him on Janna. I get it. It's kind of a signature pick for him, but if Rakan is going to be left up, it wasn't in this game because they weren't on blue side, but if you have the opportunity to take Rakan, if you yourself want to leave up something like Nautilus and just trade engagers, I think that's a relatively fine way to think of things. And I think that's really kind of where you're going to be getting the best out of these players. So that's the direction I would head in for the rest of this series. I should say the one last game of this series, because we are at the final game here. Silver Scrapes game number 5. It is win or go home. The winner will be moving on to the next round of the playoffs to take on FunPlus Phoenix. The loser will have their spring split cut short and ended here today. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Ninjas in Pyjamas, they break the trend of going back and forth and back and forth. They are going to take game number 5, and they are going to be the team to move on to round number 3. Unfortunately for WE, this is where their journey ends in the spring split. Obviously, I think they did relatively well. Really, a lot of experts thought that they were going to go out in round number 1. A lot of other analysts picked OMG to win that first series. This is exactly how I thought this would go. I think my prediction was NIP in 4, but my spread I think was 4 or 5, so I'm really not shocked to see NIP come out on top in this series. I think WE put up a pretty good fight. And I know these games were relatively boring, but this game was definitely the most fun of the bunch. Maybe it was the stakes, maybe it was the circumstance, but for this entire series to come down to a 50-50 smite between Aki and Hang, like, can you ask for more than that? Is there really more that you can get for that? This was a pretty crazy game. Ninjas in Pyjamas did hold a lot of the cards, I would say, for it, and so it's really hard for me to sit here and say that, you know, them winning the 50-50 was the only thing that won them the game, because I think they put themselves in a good spot to even be there in the first place. However, if they don't get that smite, they definitely lose, and getting that smite meant they definitely won. So it really was kind of a 50-50 for the game and for their entire playoff life, I guess, which is really funny to think about in context, but they did a lot of good things outside of that as well. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Rookie. I very much considered giving this to Aki as well. Maybe not player of the game, but player of the series as a whole to Aki. I just couldn't quite justify it after game number 1. I don't think he played particularly well in that first game, and I don't think Rookie had a bad game in this series, even in the ones that they ended up losing. Fofo was very good on the other side of this matchup, was very clearly ready to try and go into Rookie and try to keep this series, you know, relatively even, try to, you know, stop Rookie from getting out of control. The problem is you can only do that so much against R5 Aurelion Sol. There are really only so many things you can do to stop the inevitable dragon from getting online. People complain about Smolder, but I think Aurelion Sol is like the same exact thing as Smolder. Maybe a little bit more difficult to execute, but really like not really that difficult to execute. So I don't know. I think Ricky was very good, obviously, in game number 5, but a lot of it was his champion. He was walking around getting quadra kills in the back half of this game, and it was pretty fun to watch, but he was definitely kind of the big difference maker in terms of the fights. And again, like I said, he was probably the most consistent member, but if you wanted to give player of the series to Aki, I think that's also a very valid call. Aki was terrific in this series. Even in their losses, I thought he was generally fine outside of that game number 1, where he just wasn't quite as good, but games 2 through 5, I think he was a very big influence on this team as a whole, and this Sejuani game, this Sejuani in general for this team is very positive. I really like his ability to play these facilitators, to go into things like Trundle that generally should be hard counters and still actively apply pressure. And obviously he single-handedly won game 5 by winning that smite. Shouldn't have been a 50-50, but it was, and so credit to Aki for being able to get it. Photic I thought was pretty good this series. Juo was pretty good this series. The only negative I would give is that I wish Shanji was a bit better. He had that one game in game number 2 that you're looking at and it's like, man, he dominated game 2. They played around him on the Rumble. That was a really positive sign. Perhaps that was something they could move into the future with. However, outside of that, he really didn't play well for the other 4 games, and he was definitely worse than Wayward in this one, and so you're not super enthused about that. It certainly doesn't change any sort of thoughts about what Ninjas in Pyjamas were going into this series. The upside is still there, but it doesn't look like it might be coming together for the playoffs, at least in this series. It didn't quite change, but Rookie and Aki were certainly good enough, and Photic and Juo as a secondary carry are very strong in that role. So Ninjas in Pyjamas walking away from a very close series, but it was close, and WE should not feel bad that they ended up losing this. I think they tried their absolute best against a team that, quite frankly, is better than them. They did a lot of really good things throughout this series. Unfortunately, dead of the game has to go to someone here in game number 5, and pretty obviously it's going to go to Stay. You can say what you want about whether or not, you know, Stay is like absolutely better than Prince as a player. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, as I've talked about in previous segments. I think Prince as a player has an argument to be made that he is more mechanically talented, but golly, this team just doesn't want to play a style that actually lets him do any of the things that he's good at. And Stay, I think, is significantly better on weak side, which is why I think he's better for this team as a whole. It was the right decision to play Stay in these playoff series. That has become abundantly clear, but he didn't play very well here in game 5. He was consistently getting dove by the Sedge and by the Nautilus in a lot of these fights, and he really didn't get to do anything. I get that Varus is low mobility and that you don't really have a lot of peel on this team outside of potentially Rakan if he does want to stick around instead of just full engaging on the enemy, but, you know, Aurelion Sol blew him up in a lot of these fights, and he was never really relevant. This was kind of a 5v4 in a lot of the late game team fights, and that's never really an ideal position to be in when the one person that is getting destroyed is your AD carry. Really not in this meta. You can't get away with that. Wayward and Fofo were definitely the standouts for me for WE in this series. Wayward was excellent. For WE, he made one critical error error in this game number 5 that really put his team in a bad spot. But outside of that, he was really good in this game, and he was really good in this series as a whole. I think he was definitely WE's best player. Certainly not something that's entirely surprising. He was their best and most productive player in the regular season as well. However, I know a lot of people still are kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop when it comes to Wayward because of the perception that he's gotten for many years on top esports. I've always pushed back on that perception. I always thought he was better than he got credit for. I think he for sure proved that over the course of this year, but I hope he's able to keep it up moving forward. And Fofo is also a player that I think has been relatively underrated throughout his time in the LPL. Off the Rift, you're never really mad about watching him lose just because, of all the stuff. But on the Rift, I think he is a very talented player and one that I think a lot of people dislike because of the off the Rift stuff. Hang just wasn't good enough. Aki was certainly better, and Awandi certainly had his own problems in this series. But WE certainly made it close. When you're one smite away from being able to win a best of 5 against a pretty good team in Ninjas in Pyjamas, you're probably not all that bad of a team. And so I imagine they're just going to retool and move into next split with probably the same 5. I would be shocked if they made any sort of actual changes. But congratulations to NIP. You move on now to take on FunPlus Phoenix. We'll, of course, preview that at the end of the video, but they've earned it. They played really well in this series. A couple of their players really stepped up, and I'm excited to see if they can actually, complete what I predicted in my full bracket prediction and make the top 4. But now moving on to our second of the round 2 series here, and if the first one was kind of interesting, this one is very interesting. I prefaced this in my preview by saying it's the closest matchup in the entire bracket for me of any outcome possible. It is the number 6 seeded LNG Esports taking on the number 7 seeded Weibo Gaming. I can't think of a matchup that is more evenly matched in the playoffs. When I was doing my full bracket prediction, this was the one I spent the most time actively trying to consider who I think would actually win in, because I think both of these teams are incredibly similar, not only in terms of how they execute the things that they do, but just like what they're able to execute, what the good things about them are. I think it's very similar. Their narratives are similar. Their inconsistencies are similar. There is a lot to like about both of these teams, and there is a lot to dislike about both of these teams, which makes a series like this, a best of 5 between the two of them, incredibly interesting to think about. But we're actually going to get the outcome, the results of it. Like I said in my preview video, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm just going to talk about it very quickly. This is a 50-50 to me. I mean, whoever you think is going to show up more on the day, that's probably who's going to win. I really don't think that there is a better team here. I think generally people are picking LNG to win this series, and while if I was forced to pick a team, I would pick LNG. I said I think it was like 51-49 for me in favor of LNG, but like it's basically a 50-50, right? But the reason I push back on LNG being big favorites in any way in this series is that all these people criticize Weibo Gaming for not really having that game-to-game consistency, and they talk up LNG because they went on this big win streak at the end of the year. Obviously, anybody who watched the primer will know I'm very low on LNG's quote-unquote win streak at the end of the year. They essentially only beat teams that were in like the bottom 7. I mean, great. Like you started 2-6, but those losses in the 2-6 were to JD Gaming, and they were to, Top Esports, and they were to Billy, and you were playing the best teams in the league. You were actively going up against the hardest teams, and you were losing. Now, you go on this big win streak at the end of the year, and who are you beating? You're beating Rare Atom, you're beating Edward Gaming, you're beating Ultra Prime. Like, great, you're supposed to beat those teams. It feels very interesting to me because their schedule was so imbalanced, because all of their hard games were early on in the year and all of their easy games were at the end of the year. It kind of gives this perception that the changes that they made in the middle of the year actually helped propel them into the version that they are now, whereas I really don't think there's a big difference between how they were at the beginning of the split and how they are now. I just think their opponents have been easier, and so I could absolutely see a world in which they go out in this series. But Weibo, it's not like they're the kind of team that I think could consistently capitalize on those errors. They make a ton of errors themselves. They were pretty good in round number 1, certainly not perfect. I think that they had their own problems in that series against Invictus Gaming, where honestly, like if Invictus had played their actual starting 5 with Leon in the lineup all 5 games, do they win that series? That is a real question to ask. They put Leon in game number 3, they win game 3, they win game 4, and then they lose game 5. It's still a 2-1 record against IG with their best possible lineup, and that's certainly not the biggest confidence builder going into a series like this, but their upside is still immense. 3 of the players on this team made World Finals last year in Xiaohu, Light, and Crisp. And it's not like Xiaohao and ZDZ are complete pushovers. ZDZ was the player of the series in round number 1, even if he hasn't exactly been the biggest strength in the entire world for this team. He was really good in their playoff series, and so that's something to definitely consider together, and Xiao Hao is certainly someone that I like a lot individually as a player, and I think he's really started to find his own groove as like the kind of player that can fit into the rest of the team with what they want to do. And so, you know, Weibo can win this series super easily, which is why I consider this a 50-50, but LNG could also win this series super easily. Scout and Gala might just be the two best players in the entire series, and that's why I think a lot of people want to see LNG win it, but the consistency for both of these teams has been at pretty much an all-time low for what they have been over the past couple of years, and you really don't know who's going to be able to come out on top until you watch the games. Whoever shows up more on the day is probably going to win the series because there is just not a big enough gap to really overcome in that instance, in my opinion. So let's talk about it. What ended up happening in a game-by-game sense? Well, we got to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a bit of a repeat of what they showed at the beginning of the Invictus Gaming series, which I think generally was a very good sign. They weren't able to continue that, obviously, throughout all 5 games. Hopefully, they are able to be, at the very least, a little bit more consistent in this one, but it's really nice to see them come out and pick up this game number 1 win. Look very good in a very important performance. I think they just outplayed their opposition across the board. They played a comp that I think really worked for the enemy team in their previous series, kind of stealing the Draven Ashe idea from Invictus. And that's a pretty cool thing to do if they end up collecting the Infinity Stones as they keep going on, just taking styles from every team they beat. They're going to be pretty dangerous to end up going into at the end of these playoffs, but really nice game from them. Not so nice from LNG. The problems that they ran into the regular season very much continued here, but honestly, I would argue that this was a little bit worse because it was the players that were playing well in the regular season that you gave priority to in this draft, that you gave a lot of resources to in this game, and they couldn't quite come up and actually make that worthwhile. You know, the concerns in the regular season were way because he just doesn't fit with the rest of this team. Scout was not consistent in any sort of way, and you know, that was kind of the concern, is that jungle mid just was never going to be great from a game-to-game basis as a duo because these two playstyles contradict so heavily, but Gala and Hong were the strength of this team in the regular season. That's not even really debatable in my eyes. They were both very good, and they were not good in game number 1. So we'll talk about it, but player of the game, also pretty obvious for me. It's going to go to Xiao Hao. As soon as this team started flipping into more tanks in the jungle, as soon as they started moving away from Xin Zhao and Lee Sin and these aggressive picks every single game and started playing Maokai and Sejuani and things of that nature, honestly, this team got infinitely better. I don't think Xiao Hao is necessarily a tank player. Like, when you look back at his time on AL, he really was at his absolute best when he was on carries, and so it's very interesting to me that he has joined this team and has been a really big priority tank player for them, but it's not shocking with the rest of the composition of how this team likes to operate. Light is definitely a very consistent player. Maybe not the flashiest in the entire world, isn't going to make those Jackie Love aggressive plays, but is going to be very good on a game-to-game basis. Crisp is very aggressive, but oftentimes in very weird ways. Obviously, very good flanker, very good team fighter, but he likes playing marksman as well. He can play the Ashe at a pretty high level, and Xiaohu's just kind of Xiaohu. He's a great team fighter, not necessarily a huge early game presence. So when you're looking at that, you can see where situations where you have like a Xin Zhao or you have like a Lee Sin that really wants to establish a lot of skirmishing and priority early on in games can maybe not be as beneficial. This team has been better ever since the Maokai has been prioritized, and Xiao Hao is honestly very good at Maokai. He's able to control the map. He knows the matchups very well. I would expect this team to continue to go to things like this because I think it really does help them out. And then, of course, there are other good players. ZDZ was way better than Zika on the other side of this matchup. He was great in their first playoff series against Invictus. It's really nice to see him carry that over here into game number 1 of round number 2. Crisp was very good on the Ashe, like I already stated, very much worthwhile. In terms of picking up early on in drafts, I think Ashe Maokai was the first rotation for Weibo in this draft, and I think that's always going to be a very good idea for teams like Weibo. Light was very solid on the Draven. Xiaohu did a good job on the LeBlanc to actually apply that pressure on a champion that we're really not seeing all that much of in pro right now. I think it was just a good game overall from Weibo Gaming. Maybe not perfect, but certainly good enough to be able to win it, and Xiao Hao just controls tempo so well that it's very difficult for teams to play into that Maokai. I honestly would expect LNG to ban it for the rest of the series. I really don't see any reason to let it through. This team has been entirely different with and without the Maokai. Not even just the Maokai, but with engaged junglers just in general. So I could see a high priority on banning that out in future games. But for LNG, the other problems, you just need to clean up your play. Very concerning stuff coming in from the bot lane. Like I said, they were the strength in the regular season. Gala was an all-pro for me. Hong probably would have been an all-pro if he actually played the entirety of the split, but ever since he came in. This bot lane has been significantly better in terms of their isolated 2v2. The problem is that did not apply at all here to game number 1. Gala is done of the game. I think you could theoretically give this to Hong on the Bard as well. Like I said, they invested a lot into this bot lane. Varus Bard is a very aggressive bot lane, and specifically when you're picking Bard, you're really relying on your support to actually go out and make a ton of plays and be a big proactive playmaker, and Hong just wasn't that in this game. Gala's positioning was horrendous, constantly getting picked off by Ash arrows or LeBlanc diving the backline or being in range of Maokai W, which is like a cardinal sin for the Varus. It just wasn't a very clean or good game from Gala. This is a player who has stepped up in important moments in the past. You have to hope that it's just game 1 jitters or a bad game here or there and that he's going to be able to bounce back, because this is not good. Weiwei lost a lot of pressure and Scout was generally fine. Those two, they were the concern going in. I don't think they were all that bad, at least in comparison to the rest of the team here in the first game, but Zika completely outplayed on the top side of the map. ZDZ continues his hot streak, and Zika was kind of the recipient of that on the Renekton. Just not a very good game number 1 from LNG. They're going to have to be a lot cleaner. Specifically, this bot lane is going to have to step up if they want to win the rest of these games. Going down 2-0 against Weibo, not a great position. You do not want to go down 2-0 or 0-2 against anybody in the LPL, but Weibo, especially when they're hot, are going to destroy you in that circumstance. So a big game 2 here. Can Weibo take full control of this series by going up 2-0, or is LNG going to even things up at 1 apiece? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. We're going to get a 2-0 series lead for Weibo in this one. And this is a very good place for Weibo Gaming to be. Winning 2 games in a row, getting up 2-0, especially after that previous series, it's a pretty comforting thing to see. Obviously, Weibo, there is no lead that is safe with Weibo, because they can throw any lead, they can throw any series in any game. It just kind of is how this team operates, but this is a very good place for them to be. LNG, this is not a good place to be. If you want to keep your season alive in your first playoff series, you're going to have to win 3 games in a row against a Weibo Gaming team that has 3 members who just went to the World Finals last year. This is not going to be an easy challenge. This is not going to be an easy task. It definitely is possible, but Weibo winning this definitely changes the complexion of this series as a whole. Player of the game for me in game 2, maybe controversially, is going to go to Xiaohu in the mid lane. I know people like to think he's way too aggressive and sometimes puts himself in bad positions, and while I agree, I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that he's never done that before or that he's not making major mistakes when he does that. I would prefer you be aggressive on Tristana, and the same thing that we saw in the previous series against IG, we saw here. We saw an aggressive support, in this case a Nico, who's not even really a support, somebody who really wants to be out there making plays, being active, trying to actively push the tempo of the game forward with early game power like Nico has, with a Maokai Tristana jungle mid duo. That has been the combo for Weibo Gaming over the course of these playoffs. I would expect these two to continue to be drafted whenever available for Weibo. I think especially on red side, like red 1, red 2, like Maokai Tristana, if it is available, expect them to take it because it has been major for them. I think Xiaohu was the most important player in terms of actually capitalizing on the things that were created this game. I think broadcast gave player of the game to Crisp. I love Crisp. Trust me, I'm like the biggest Crisp fan on the planet at this point, but I don't think he really did anything all that special in this game. Like, he was fine on the Nico, and he was moving around. The R5 Nico was a positive for this team overall, for sure. It certainly did create, a lot of mismatch scenarios that I don't think LNG was prepared to actually try and deal with, but Nico's not the hardest champion to execute on, especially from the support position. Again, credit to him for being in the right place at the right time, and his positioning is critical in a lot of these fights. Consistently able to get multiple man ultimates off on Nico is really big, but it's really not all that hard as long as you're able to actually execute on it. And once they started winning in the early game, Crisp's job became infinitely easier. So I give it to Xiaohu. I think you could once again give it to Xiao Hao in the jungle, who just continues to look amazing every single time he gets Maokai. He is so good at this champion in their current state. Like, it's just perfect for how they want to play the game, because he can be so aggro and he can get away with so many more aggressive plays than he would typically be able to get away with on other champions. It's very forgiving, and it allows him to have a very clear and defined role in late game team fights, which I think he has sometimes struggled with as an individual player, even going back to his time on Anyone's Legends. So Xiao Hao, Xiaohu, Crisp, they were the core of the team this game, and they were solid. Light was also good on the Kalista. I certainly don't want to make it seem like it's bad. When you're playing into something like Lucian Nami, to be able to establish that pressure pre-level 3, I think is actually super important, because Lucian Nami, by the time you hit level 6, when you get to that one item, they're going to be the strongest champions in the game. It's just how they function. It's the point of trying to play them, and so if you can get that early advantage and get the Kalista there a lot quicker, take advantage of that early level level 3 alongside Crisp, then all of a sudden, you know, Light's going to be in a really good spot as well. Going deathless in this game wasn't particularly easy, but it's something that I think he did well. ZDZ was fine. Kasante's a very strong champion, and he was definitely better on the top side, but Weibo definitely built around this core of, like, jungle mid support. Very similar to what we've been talking about with teams like WE in the past. Building around the middle of the map, allowing your support to be very active and roaming on the map, and really just playing around the macro game. And then for LNG, just kind of traditional LNG loss. This is very similar to what happened in the regular season to this team multiple times. Weiwei's going to get done of the game because he was playing Rel and never was able to establish pressure, and then every single engage he went for in these skirmishes or in these front-to-back fights, he would just go in, get a bit of CC off, and then instantly die because he's so far behind that he's not tanky enough to survive any of these engages. Again, it's just a problem. Weiwei's not been good this year. There's really nothing else to say. Whether you want to blame it on his individual skill or the fit with the rest of this team, I think is really up to your personal preference, but this was a pretty poor Rel game from Weiwei. Zika was also not very good once again on the top side. He has been bad, I would say, in the first 2 games of this series. Not that top lane has particularly mattered. Really, neither game has been relevant in the top lane at any point. It's been the mid and the bot lane that have ended up kind of spiraling the game out of control, but if Zika had been stronger on the Renekton, perhaps he could have delayed this game longer to get things like the Azir online, perhaps get Rel some items, so that when she does go for these more aggressive engages, she can actually pull them off and survive before she just instantly gets blown up. You know, this is all wishful thinking. I don't think Renekton alone would have saved this game, but it's certainly something that I don't think would have hurt. And then you got Scout, Gala, and Hong. They were fine. I guess Hong was definitely taken advantage of towards the back half of this game. Tristana needed a target to continuously jump on and blow up, and Nami's a pretty good target to get those resets off on. Scout tried his best to be able to save this game. A couple of good fights on the Azir, but really not enough. And Gala, very passive. Didn't really make any mistakes, but that Kalista started spiraling out of control because the Nico was getting a lot of advantages, and all of a sudden Gala on this, you know, mid-game power spiker can't actually skirmish at all in the mid-game, so there's really no plays to be made when it comes to the Lucian. This was just a bad game, and now LNG is in about the worst position possible. They're going to have to reverse sweep Weibo Gaming if they do want to move on to the next round, which is never an easy task. If Weibo just wins one more, this series is over. It could potentially be a sweep, or Weibo could kind of screw it up. They're both of equal possibility in terms of my brain, because Weibo Gaming is never safe with any lead that they have. So are they going to be able to close it out very cleanly in a sweep, or is LNG going to, at the very least, delay this one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was LNG. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to, at the very least, stay alive for one more game here and push us to a game number 4. Thank God they didn't go out completely winless in the playoffs. That would have felt pretty disastrous for them. I think they would have felt pretty not good about that, but at least they're able to pick up a win here, and I think they did it in relatively good fashion. It was a decently dominant game. They were able to get blue side, which means they were able to get priority on whatever they wanted, and what has become abundantly clear is that if you ban out Maokai and first pick Tristana, you're probably going to win the game. Like, they really are that strong right now. I know that there are certain champions that are kind of permaban at this level, you know, things like the Rumble, things like the Ashe, that have really been taken away regularly by a lot of different teams. The Nautilus has really not been allowed throughout either of these series, but I think Tristana and Maokai have kind of proven themselves to be the biggest performers so far in the LPL playoffs, and I don't really know if that's going to continue, but it's certainly an interesting trend to keep track of at the current moment, and that very much carried over here. Player of the game is going to go to Scout in the mid lane on that Tristana, who they drafted first in this draft. Trist just generates so much prio. I understand the idea behind letting it through, because theoretically you should be able to just out macro it, because Trist actually has to play with the rest of her team. She has to do a lot of things, you know, with her jungler, with her support. You know, she's not necessarily this kind of champion that can just move around the map with incredible mobility and be able to engage any sort of fight at any time. You can take advantage of Trist in the right circumstances, but the circumstances have not presented themselves all that recently. It's been a very, very good run for this champion, and Scout, I think, piloted it well. When you can be really aggressive, when you can get those resets, you can get a lot of kills on that champion and really start to take over not only the mid game, but team fights. And I think, again, the prio that it generates in the mid lane in terms of the 1v1, it really takes out a lot of the advantages that a champion like Talia on the other side of this matchup ends up having, because no longer can she just shove and roam, because Triss can actually match the wave pressure, and also Triss can just kill Talia if she leaves lane, and so it does become a lot more difficult for the Talia to end up playing. We'll talk about that when we get further along in the Weibo section, but necessary game from Scout. We've talked about it in the past. Scout has always been the kind of player that really turns up when his team's back is against the wall. It's kind of been a trend, I would say, for him as a player over the course of his time on EDG, you know, on LNG here. He really has been somebody who, when everything else is going wrong, he's the one that can kind of lock in and figure things out. It was nice to see that happen at a pretty pivotal time here, I would say, in game number 3 with their split on the line. I think I also want to give a big shout out to Zika in the top lane. I know Cassante isn't exactly the most difficult champion in the world to pilot, but Zika's been very bad in the first 2 games, and so to see him actually play well here in game number 3, I think is definitely a positive. Weibo was solid on the brand, but I continue to think that champion is one of the easiest to pilot in the entire game from ahead, especially when you've got something like a Tristana that's just permanently going to get you priority in the middle of the map. All of a sudden, these skirmishes become a lot easier. Nobody can walk up to these two as a duo. And then Gala and Hung were fine. I think Lucian Nami is still something I'm a bit concerned about. The Lucian has felt relatively useless in comparison to maybe some of the other AD carries that we're seeing, but with a double marksman comp on the other side, the Nami actually proved to be very valuable, and Hung, I think, was very good this game. Even if he did die a little bit too much. He was caught out a little bit too much. I think Scout was definitely the star. I know Zika had a pretty good game and Weiwei was relevant, but Scout really was the one that kind of pushed this team over the edge. And then for Weibo on the other side, dud of the game is going to go to Xiaohu in the mid lane. Pretty big mid gap in this one, but like I said, honestly, Taliyah into Tristana can really snowball out of control in a negative way for the Taliyah player very quickly if things go wrong in the first 10 minutes. There are also worlds in which Taliyah just has significantly more mobility and, you know, that team plays the map better, and all of a sudden every objective is going in favor of the Taliyah team in Weibo's case, and then things, you know, kind of spiral in that way, but that's not what happened here. They just weren't really able to ever get any sort of pressure in the mid lane, and I think losing that from the Taliyah, essentially playing a 4v5 here with her not really being able to do damage, her ability to side lane not nearly as impactful as it would be in a traditional game, I do think it was a bit of a problem because there was just never a moment where she was ever going to be able to survive in these fights for longer than a couple of seconds, and Tristana was getting resets after resets, so not a great game from Xiaohu, but I don't think anybody played great. I think Late and Crisp were solid. I like Zeri Lulu. I still think it's a very strong lane. Lulu is underplayed, in my opinion, in the current meta, but I get it. People don't want to play enchanters. I'm not going to sit here and try to convince people to play enchanters. They're very boring to play. You would rather play Rakan, you'd rather play Nautilus, you'd rather play Blitzcrank, etc., right? But I think if you want to win, like, Lulu's a pretty good shout. Still does a lot of really good things, and Light was really solid here again. Not really a lot of mistakes. R5 Zeri is going to give you some pretty good control. What I don't love here is Varus top. I think it's just a little bit too much for a circumstance like this. With your split on the line, and specifically with it being ZDZ, who I don't want to try to criticize too much, but it just feels like a pretty heavy pick for a player that's probably not going to get the resources to keep that up. Obviously, you're not going to get eliminated if you lose this game. This is cooking a little bit, but I just don't think I would have gone for this in a playoff series, especially with the kind of way that Weibo likes to play the game. I don't think it really furthers their win condition in any sort of way, so, you know, don't love that. I think Xiaohao was fine, and Light and Crisp were a positive. I would say, you know, at times they were the better bot lane, but generally Scout was the best player and certainly the most active on the map, and that means that LNG is able to keep this series alive. Are they going to be able to do that once more and take all of this momentum that they're going to get from 2 games in a row into a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or was it just an outlier? Did they win game number 3 and, you know, it was just kind of a pity game? Weibo took Varus top and, you know, they didn't really play around their Fed Zeri. They didn't really get to do a whole ton. Was it just an outlier, or is LNG going to be able to make this series incredibly interesting with another win? Well, the winner of game number 4 was LNG. They are going to take game number 4, and all of a sudden this series has become a lot more interesting. We've gone from 2-0 Weibo Gaming to 2-2. We are going into a Silver Scrapes game number 5 for the second time in the second round here, and LNG has the full scale of momentum going into this because this was a deathless game for them. No one on the team died. They were really able to control everything on the map. Everyone played really well. There really isn't a single player that I can point out and be like, you were infinitely better than the others on the team, and Weibo looks lost and disoriented. I will say, this happened to them last round as well, like a couple of days ago. I almost said last week. I've almost said last week a couple of times, but it was just a couple of days ago. They went up 2-0 against Invictus. They lost games 3 and 4, and then they eventually won game number 5. Not saying that that's a pattern, but certainly something to keep in mind. But right now, LNG looks like the better team by a considerable margin, having found a strategy that has really worked for them. A very weird and kind of interesting draft. I think you're lacking a lot of late game insurance in terms of the damage. I don't really know how you win this game if you don't win it early. Lucky for them, they won it early. This is what I always talk about. I think this is like a significantly worse draft than Weibo had on the other side here. Weibo's got a Rumble, a Viego, a Zeri. Like, you have so many win conditions on this team to be able to play for 5v5s, and it's not like these champions are particularly weak in the early game. You have a lot of ways to be able to actually play out this game. The problem is, LNG has indexed super heavily into one phase of the game. Again, if it goes wrong, you've got Nidalee, Senna, Twisted Fate. Like, these champions, like, Senna will scale, but she's not going to carry the game for you in that same kind of way. TF will be useful, but he can't win 5v5s, and Weibo can force those with their comp. Same thing with Aatrox. He's a little bit more indexed into the early part of the game, although he can still be useful in team fights, and Nidalee falls off. It's like, you don't really have a win condition in the later part of the game. In 5v5s, you don't really have a way to win if you're not already super far ahead. Lucky for LNG, the game plan was get super far ahead, and that's exactly what they did. So, you know, this kind of just goes back to the point that I always talk about of any team comp can win if it has a win. If you have one win condition, it doesn't matter how difficult to execute it is, how improbable it is. If you do it, you're probably going to win the game. And that's what LNG did here with what is, in my opinion, a significantly worse draft. So we'll talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Zika in the top lane. I thought the Aatrox was exceptional in this one. He was so active on the map, constantly looking to be aggressive, constantly looking to take fights, and that's what you should do when you're in such a commanding position. But to do that and never really put yourself in any sort of harm's way, it's just impressive stuff coming out from Zika, a player who has struggled in this series, I would say, up until this point. Definitely a better game number 3, but a great game 4 here, even though he struggled in games 1 and 2. Really couldn't get over that Renekton hump, but put him on Aatrox, and he is going to be significantly more useful, as we saw here. Weiwei also deserves a pretty big shout out, in my opinion. Nidalee is one of those champions where when you get the ball rolling on Nidalee, it just keeps rolling and it keeps going, and Weiwei had probably easily his best game of the series in this one as well, being able to generate that tempo early. It can be scary playing Nidalee into Viego unless you're like really comfortable on Nidalee, because if you're not ahead by 10-15 minutes, like Viego's just going to fight you over and over, and there's nothing you can really do about it at that point to get those resets, and you're not really all that useful in the 5v5 either. Again, I've explained that, but Weiwei, Zika, definitely the standout players from LNG on my side. The rest of the team was good as well, specifically Gala. I really like how he plays Senna. He plays her very aggro. He's constantly looking to try and, you know, play alongside the rest of his team to get into these fights. It's not necessarily just this scaling archetype where you're getting souls and trying to get that max range so you can be more useful in the late game. It's actively using Senna's early game, like, healing powers to be able to enable more skirmishes and really take a lot of 3v3s and objective fights, and I think that generally is more of a positive thing overall than just kind of scaling with Senna. But everybody knows I love Senna TK. I think it's the strongest Senna lane by a considerable margin. Scout was also good on TF. I think TF is super underrated as a mid laner now. I think it's very funny how he's essentially just become a top laner at the pro level. He's still very good in the mid lane. He does a lot of the similar things in the mid lane. He maybe doesn't have as much prio with some of the other mids that are going to fill a similar macro-oriented role like Talia, but he is still very viable there, and his laning really isn't that bad after the changes. And so, you know, LNG ends up executing on their draft better, even if I don't love what they ended up picking in the first place. And then Weibo just kind of struggled here in general. There really isn't one player I can point to and say you were the problem. ZDZ got destroyed in the top lane matchup. The Rumble did not work out here in game 4. Xiao Hao never had pressure. Went for something that was going to try to be a little bit more consistent over the course of an entire game. Again, indexing into that later game with the rest of this draft, and just never was able to get to that point. Chris was really bad. Every engage he went for, he just died. Even sometimes when he was just walking around, he just died. That's kind of a support's job, though, when you're losing 16-0. And then my dud of the game is going to go to Light. His positioning in this game was, like, awful. Like, I know we can actively pinpoint to a couple of players that played bad, and nobody on Weibo played well. You don't really lose 16-0 by playing well. It's just not how that goes. But Light's positioning was truly extraordinarily bad. You don't usually see this out of him individually as a player. Just stepping up way too far, not really respecting the enemy's range, and he was really, really quick to give a lot of gold over to the enemy team. So, you know, it's hard to really give an analysis bit for this game because it was over by 8 minutes. Like, there really was nothing else to do. They picked an early game comp and they stomped them. It's just kind of, it's going to happen every once in a while, but all the momentum is now in LNG's favor. There's no other way to word that. They have every bit of confidence going into this game number 5, and Weibo somehow is in a familiar position for themselves. We talked about how it was concerning whenever this team is in any position of responsibility because they just never actually live up to the expectations that are set on them. So up 2-0, they are now at 2-2. If they bottle this, they're going to be laughed at until the start of the summer split. That I can guarantee. But LNG, they need to keep their season alive. Both of these teams need to keep their season alive with a win here. It is win or go home in a Silver Scrapes game number 5. So who is going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Weibo Gaming, they are going to take game number 5. They are going to win this series 3-2, and they are, for the second series in a row, going to prevent the reverse sweep by somehow salvaging it in the final game. For LNG, you did your best to try to come back. You dominated game number 4. You certainly made this series interesting, but Weibo was the better team. I think that was pretty clear in this game number 5, and it was pretty clear in this series. I talked about it just kind of being a 50-50, being whichever team ended up being better. I predicted that would be LNG, that Scout and Gala would step it up when it mattered the most, but that was not the case. The player that stepped it up the most to me is going to be my player of the game in Game 5 and my player of the series, and this was not a difficult decision. It's going to go to Xiao Hao in the jungle. He's been amazing for Weibo ever since he came back in the lineup from getting benched. I don't know if it was just a reality check, a wake-up call for him. He's always been a player that has improved as the year has gone along. When you look back to his Anyone's Legend splits that he's had in the past couple of years, 2022, 2023, both of them, he was pretty good in spring, like okay in spring, and then elite in summer. And so this is a player that has always ramped up his gameplay the longer the year has gone on, and that applies to playoffs here. We never really knew that because he played for AL, and that org can't make playoffs if they tried, but Xiao Hao was excellent in this series and truly was kind of a game breaker for them. He was by far the biggest impact that they had. Xinjiao was a pick that I've honestly been kind of talking some trash about on this channel, at least in comparison to like other LPL junglers. Maokai Sejuani seem like much more secure picks. Both of them banned out in this game. You got to go more aggressive, so you go for that Xin, and it very much works out. He was excellent this game, constantly creating advantages for the rest of his team, and he played off of his carries really well. We'll talk about Scout in a second. Scout was able to generate some advantages by getting some quick resets on Light and on Crisp and on Xiaohu. It just didn't really matter. Scout made some major mistakes towards the back half, and Xinjiao was actually very clutch in being able to contain the Tristana with those knockups, and so credit to Xiaohu. He did a great job, but Xiaohu, Light, they are the other two that I think deserve a lot of credit for this game. Light was everywhere, like a lot more than people are going to give him credit for in this game, especially bouncing back after what was a really bad positioning effort in game number 4. I know a lot went wrong across the board in that game, but Light was definitely more noticeable in terms of how things didn't end up working out, so to see him play a really good game number 5, a player who was super clutch at Worlds, was one of the big reasons why they made World Finals. Him and the Shy were definitely the two best players on the team at that tournament. It's nice to see that clutch gene from last year is carried over into the playoffs here, but for Xiaohu, he was also really good, definitely the more consistent mid laner. Didn't really make any like big, grand mistakes, but he was really just there to facilitate the Xinjiao being a little bit more proactive in the mid game, and that's exactly what happened. Do you want to see more out of Crisp in a game like this? Absolutely. He could have absolutely been more valuable. And do you want to see more out of ZDZ? Probably. Like, he was fine, but he certainly wasn't a problem. Xiao Hao, Xiaohu, and Light were the 3 carries, and that's a really good thing to say, especially Xiao Hao, who I think really could be a game breaker for this team if he ends up getting everything together, and it really does seem like it's coming together for him. So, very big win for Weibo. You've got to be happy that they're moving on, but for LNG, to not win a single playoff series in the spring split has to be considered a disappointment, and, you know, as much as I'd love to sit here and do some I told you so bit, I'm not really going to do that. I didn't predict them to lose, and so I don't think that's necessarily fair. I know I was significantly lower on them, and, you know, I've spent the last essentially 2.5, 3 weeks, maybe even like a month, pumping the brakes on LNG, talking about how this win streak is inflated and how I don't think it would apply to the playoffs. Even I didn't think they were going to lose this, though, and it's not a particularly good look. They got the Tristana on B1, but there are pros and there are cons to Tristana. Yes, she's able to generate a ridiculous amount of prio and pressure in the mid lane, which in my opinion is the most important thing in the game right now, but alternatively, she gives you that go in button that if you use it the wrong time is just going to get you killed and is going to lose your team the entirety of that momentum that the champion inherently generates. You don't want to play Tristana like Malphite. I know it's a bit of a meme on Reddit, but Scout got super far ahead in this game, getting some resets, and was actually able to be very relevant, and then he would jump into the middle of team fights, get instantly CC'd, and die, and the game is over in those instances. It's very disappointing. He's going to get dead of the game. If he was cleaner, they had a chance to win this. They weren't out of this game entirely. They were keeping up in a lot of different instances. Their side laning was actually very good here in game number 5. It's just some costly decision-making errors in terms of when to go in and when to play it safe really cost this team in the end, but You know, I'm not just going to sit here and blame it on Scout. Like, could Weibo have had a better game? Absolutely. He's playing Brand, who's super broken and actually pretty good into Xin Zhao. I don't hate this pick at all. You have a Senna Tom Kench for scaling into the late game, and they were super passive, even if Gala really played okay in this game. And Zika, you know, outside of the 2 games that he played well in, didn't play well in this series. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but look at the 3 losses that they had. He was really bad in all 3 of those games, even if he was very good in game number 4 and really good in a lot of the rest of game number 3. It's just very, very strange to see this LNG team. They're very inconsistent, and unfortunately for them, that tracked into the playoffs for them. So they are now officially eliminated. They are getting, you know, 7th, 8th alongside Team WE. Certainly not the predicament I think they wanted to find themselves in, but also not the most surprising outcome that they could have. But Weibo Gaming has won, and they are moving on now to take on a much bigger challenge. We'll preview the JD Gaming series, obviously, at the end of this video as we get into that preview segment. But congratulations to Weibo. I don't think I expected them to get this far, although I'm not entirely surprised. This has always been a team that's had the upside to get into the top 5 or 6, hell, even the top 4. If they got a better draw in the bracket, I think they would probably be the best of the other 2 teams on the other side here, but it's unfortunate. They have a very tough challenge up ahead. They're going to need all the luck that they can get to take down one of China's giants right now. But now moving on into our previews for round number 3. This is really the make or break round. We are at every team except for the top 2. And if you win this series, you get into that top 4 and you gain that extra life. A super important round to win for all 4 teams that are involved. We're going to preview these series. I'll give you my prediction for what I think might happen and why I think it might happen, and kind of explain, you know, where these teams are at in terms of their matchup against each other. From a lane to lane perspective, I'll quickly go over that as well. And that kicks off with the upper bracket series here, the number 4 versus number 5 seed. It's the number 4 seeded FunPlus Phoenix taking on the number 5 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. Now, this series was a 2-0 in the regular season. FPX was able to overcome Ninjas in Pyjamas. This was during their big super week where they basically only beat playoff teams 2-0 and really were dominant. Milky Way looked amazing, and so definitely an interesting kind of time capsule to talk about that series. But I think from a matchup perspective, you could maybe say that the lower seed are actually the favorites going into this. I know that might not be the most popular opinion, but it's kind of the one that I'm holding right now in terms of what I expect from these 2 teams. I know Ninjas in Pyjamas didn't win in the regular season, but as you can see from what's up on the screen, they're actually going to be the team that I'm predicting in this series. For those of you who haven't watched this format up until this point in the primer or in any of the other playoff videos, I'll quickly explain what you're seeing on the screen. Of course, all of the players are listed with their most played champions, their 3 most played champions, and their win rates on the screen. If you see a number next to a player's name, that denotes where I put them in my personal all-pro teams after the regular season. So a 2 next to Milky Way means he was a second-team all-pro, etc., etc. In the middle, of course, both teams, you've got their records in the regular season. The 2 versus 0 is just how they performed against each other when they played against each other. In the regular season, FPX won 2-0, so it's listed like that. And you can see the background colors for both of the teams. FPX has some orange, and Ninjas in Pyjamas has some black. They are kind of a percentile graph, if you will, on how confident I am in this team being able to win. As you can see, the black a bit overtaking the orange here. And that's about a 60, 65-ish % swing, in my opinion, and that's the kind of confidence that I have in Ninjas in Pyjamas in this series. I think they should be the better team, and I'll explain why. I think when you look at what FPX does really well, they rely on a couple of very, very specific strategies. Either Milky Way getting some early game champion that he can just snowball the game out of control on with a couple of very facilitative or scaling-oriented picks surrounding him, most notably in the bot lane, for someone like Dectum, like a Senna, or, you know, even a Varus to bail them out, that offers some level of CC that doesn't necessarily need a lot of resources in order to be relevant. Or alternatively, giving Life something that he can be really comfortable and aggressive on. Most of the time, that's just been whenever Rumble is available. I doubt Rumble will be available in this series. If it is, it's a major mistake from NIP, and I doubt it happens for more than one game, but whenever Rumble is up, they happily take that early on in drafts. They know they can flex it up into the top lane, but most of the time that's going to be going support for Life, and he's going to destroy you on it. So Milky Way, Life, they're definitely the focal points of what FPX want to do, and that's what concerns me a bit, is actually that's a style that can be pretty counterable. I'm not saying it's perfectly counterable. I'm not saying that the mechanical gap that Milky Way has potentially over some of the other players that NIP can't be solvable by putting them on a couple of different champions, or that Life is just going to completely crumble in the playoffs, but typically speaking, when you look back historically on teams that perform in a similar way to what FPX do, a very defined style that when it works, it dominates, when it doesn't, they lose, they don't do particularly well in best of fives, at least historically. Again, perhaps they end up switching up their style. Maybe Care has a really good series, or maybe Dectum has a really good series, and all of a sudden this conversation becomes entirely different. But in the regular season, when you're talking about what FPX were, they were Milky Way, and then when Milky Way was, taken out of the game, they were Life. And outside of that, they didn't have anybody else that was going to be stepping up and winning games for them. So it's going to be interesting to see if that continues. But Ninjas in Pyjamas are actually in a unique position to take advantage of that. First of all, I think the mid lane matchup is going to be a bit of a disaster for FPX. Care has been one of the worst mid laners in the LPL, I would say. Has been a bit better down the stretch of the regular season. I think that is at least a positive for FPX going into this, and he has a track record of being at least relatively good. But Rookie's been excellent, truly an all-pro caliber mid laner throughout most of this year, and Care has just not been good. I would expect this to be majorly in favor of Ninjas in Pyjamas, and you could maybe even say the similar things, I should say, about the top lane. I know Shanji has not been playing perfect, but Zhao Lao, who is just a lower tier top laner, it truly has been Milky Way in Life carrying this team to the number 4 seed, which is why I've been so impressed with their performances. But, Zhao Lao, who is not a top 10, maybe even top 13 top laner in the LPL. He's just not in that conversation. He's really not all that good. He loses super consistently. He doesn't really have these big giant breakout performances. He had some of them last year, but that is not carried over at all into 2024. And Shanji at least has those, right? Mechanically speaking, he can go toe-to-toe with some of the better top laners. So even if he's not playing well, I would still argue that Shanji's been better this year than Zhao Lao, who on the other side, again, Aki, Photic, Zhuo, they're going to be very important because Aki can't get mega gapped here by Milky Way. That would be a bit of a problem for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Photic and Zhuo cannot get mega gapped by Dectum and Life. You can't really allow things like the Rumble to sneak their way through. And Life's not just a Rumble one trick. I want to make that clear. He's good on Nautilus. He's good on these engagers, but he is a lot better when he has that agency on a damaged champion like that. If Photic and Zhuo can kind of reign in bot lane, if Aki can just survive in the jungle matchup, I think your differences in the solo lane, specifically in the mid lane, are just going to be so big, and probably the biggest in the series, that to me is what pushes Ninjas in Pyjamas over the top. But I could see a world in which FPX, ends up winning through Milky Way and through Life. If Milky Way in particular is just the best player in the series, then that's kind of clear cut. If they don't stop him and he gets to do everything he wants to do, then it's going to be kind of difficult to imagine a world in which they lose that. But I imagine Rookie is going to come out with a vengeance, and my prediction would be Ninjas in Pyjamas in 4. My spread would be NIP in 4, NIP in 5. And so that would be my prediction. I think Rookie will be the best player in the series, and I think mid lane is going to be a bit of a problem. But again, I hope it's very fun. I feel bad for FPX because they are so hyped up and such an interesting team. They've overachieved so much this year, but I just don't think I have enough confidence to put them over in this series. And then moving into preview, the second series, the lower bracket series. This one's just as interesting. There's not going to be a playoff series at this point that is not a very interesting one to talk about with so many good teams in the LPL. It's, of course, the number 3 seeded JD Gaming taking on the number 7 seeded Weibo Gaming. And this is a very interesting matchup to talk about. I think that there are going to be some pretty interesting takes regarding these two teams. I think you're often going to find people that say one thing or the other in terms of how this matchup is definitely going to go. I'm not quite so sold on either of the arguments being made. I think JD Gaming obviously is just the better team when you look at these two on paper, when you look at their expectations, when you look at what their regular seasons were. This is a 13-3 team versus an 8-8 team, right? You would imagine this to not be particularly close, but man, Weibo just has JDG's number. Not only did they beat them both series last year, they beat them in 2-0 this year in the regular season. One of their wins was over JDG. And also, they're white hot right now. They have just gone back-to-back and won Game 5s, and that's not particularly easy to deal with. Add that onto the fact that this is the weakest JDG has looked in the last year and a half, maybe even the last 2 years. I'm really not sold on Weibo just kind of like falling out of this series. I think it's going to be a lot more competitive than people want to make it out to be, which is what you can kind of see in my percentile graph. I still gotta favor JDG. I would be an idiot to not at least think that JDG should be walking out of this series with a win. I mean, projecting Weibo would be so bold. I'm not going to be stunned if they come out here and win because there are, again, reasons to believe that there's some sort of voodoo curse on JDG that means they can't beat Weibo, but how do you not pick JD Gaming to get into the top 4? I mean, that it would that would be a ridiculous prediction. So I am picking JDG, but it's not nearly as clear-cut as I think a lot of other people would like to make it out to be. We can go position by position. Top lane's very interesting. I would actually give this to JDG in favor. I know that's kind of weird because Sheer has played so little at the LPL level, but everything he has shown has been so good. I think if he had a full split, he could have been in that same conversation with like Milky Way for Rookie of the Split for me. He really was that good in his small sample size. The guy dominated 369 in lane. That just doesn't happen on accident. I wouldn't expect that to happen every single game. I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's better than 369, but the fact that that's even possible in one game, like that's crazy. Like that shouldn't be possible for somebody of Sheer's experience level. And yet there we were. And ZDZ, for as hot as he has been, for as good as he has been in this playoff run, he's just not that same kind of guy, right? When you're going up against the best top laners in the world, the top laners in the world, you gotta just have a baseline skill level, and that's where ZDZ starts to struggle. It's why the Shy gave this team more upside, also a bit more downside, but why they gave them more upside is because he did pass kind of the hands check, if you will, in the best of scenarios. ZDZ is a risky player, but isn't always going to be able to keep up with the best top laners, and so I would give this to JDG in terms of talent. Kanavi and Yagao taking on Xiaohao and Xiaohu. I listed as such because I think both of these mid laners have been conduits for their junglers a little bit more over the course of not only this tournament in Weibo's case, but this year in JDG's case. I think it's much more about jungle mid in this case than it is about jungle and then mid. And then Kanavi and Yagao obviously have to be the favorites here. Kanavi is the best player in this series. Whether you want to, like, you'd say that Weibo's got some voodoo magic or not, Kanavi has to be going into this as the best player. He was my runner-up to MVP behind Knight. Again, there's been a lot of controversy about Knight actively winning the MVP in the LPL. People are not happy about it. I'm very happy about it. I think it's the right choice. I love Kanavi, but Knight was the guy for me, and he was a pretty easy choice to make because of all the pressure he was able to generate. That's not a conversation for now, though. Kanavi still is really good, and, you know, you're going to expect him to be able to control the early games, but Xiaohao is on fire right now, and honestly, Xiaohao's hands are ridiculous. He could make this series a lot more interesting than people think. And Yagao versus Xiaohu, I think this is going to be less influential. Of course, push matters, like pressure in terms of the mid lane matchup matters, but I think in a lot of cases that's going to be more dependent on draft between these two players than it is between the individual mechanics. Both of them are very talented, but neither are particularly aggressive in the early game. And then you have Ruler and Missing taking on Light and Crisp. This is another matchup that you theoretically would say is JDG favored because it's Ruler and Missing, and you would imagine that they're going to be fine, but honestly, I've seen more holes in their game as a duo this year than I have at any other point in their history as a duo, and Light and Crisp are the kind of bot lane that can take advantage of even the smallest amount of mistakes coming in, and especially if this team wants to play away from bot lane. Like, we've seen series where Ruler and Missing weren't quite as impressive, weren't quite as active. I know people still love to talk about Ruler, but I think they just like to mentally omit the bad games that he had this split. He had so many great games, and really, like, he had just as many good games as Knight did as MVP, but I think people do just like to selectively forget the games where he was not relevant or he made major positioning errors or he just kind of got beat. Those happened more this year than I think they have almost at any other point that I've watched Ruler, and so that's a bit of a concern. Even on his bad split, he's still the second best AD carry in the entire region, and so it's really hard to criticize him, but Light and Crisp actually have more of an opening, I would say, in this bot lane matchup than maybe you would think on paper, but generally, it's just really hard to bet against JD Gaming. How could you accept that this team won't be a top 4 team? It just would be ridiculous. It would be an utter failure for this organization to go out in their only playoff series. For Weibo, they've done a great job of getting this far, and they do have this mental advantage of consistently being able to beat JD Gaming, but I just don't think I can apply that here. I would expect JDG to win 3-0 or 3-1. That would be my prediction, but honestly, my prediction is JDG 3-0, Weibo Gaming 3-2. I think either JDG dominates this series, is the better team by a consistent margin, and just comes out and wins, right? Or I think Weibo makes this a very close series and ends up with Voodoo winning it in the end. Like, that's my spread. I know it's very weird, but, you know, the circumstances are a bit weird between these two teams. Either way, I hope it's a bit of a banger. I hope the Weibo magic ends up showing up here, and I hope JDG, you know, actually shows up in that same vein. We've seen both of these teams at their worst, I would say, over the course of this year. Hopefully we get the best versions of them in this series. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL Round 2 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We got 10 full games in today's video, the most that we could possibly get, so it did go a little bit long. I really do appreciate you guys sticking around to the end. I do hope you guys enjoyed. I do appreciate you guys watching the rest of the content as well. I know not everybody who watches the LPL watches every region that I cover here on this channel, but I am thankful for those of you who do watch as much as you can. I've posted 15 videos in the last 8 8 days. It's been a grind. We're gonna get back to 1 a day here as the barrage of games that all happened on one weekend is over. We have caught up. We are in a position now where we can get back to a more regular schedule. Thank you so much for sticking around. It has been super hectic trying to get to all these games the last couple of days, and so, I thank you guys for your patience on these videos, and I do hope you guys don't feel like there's been any sort of drop in quality. If you did enjoy the video, though, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Like I said, we don't only post about the LPL. The LCK playoffs are going, LEC playoffs are going right now, and MSI is just around the corner as well. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports right before that big mid-season tournament, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all